Hello, I'm Kads, and welcome to today's video. So today, I'm gonna put my money where my mouth is because I did come out and say that I was in support of basically the entirety of the Hydra Rebalance, and now that it is live in the game, I've run all of my keys to see what the differences between the pre-nerf and the post-nerf damage is. If you would like to hear my full take, then check out the free-to-play review of the Hydra Rebalanced for 2024 in the card up above. So before we dive into the damage delta for each of the teams, I want to talk about some things I observed while watching or spectating the runs take place. Namely, two categories of things that I noted and or should probably change. And those categories are the AI and then the Serpent's Will buff. So starting off with the AI, I noticed that most certainly it's not exactly prioritizing the right things. I think it's fair to say that it looks at affinity over the presence of Poison Cloud, because I had many champions go into attack Hydra heads that had Poison Cloud out when there was a perfectly good head without it. Even if it was weak affinity or neutral affinity, they'd go for the positive affinity head on their Poison Cloud, which is pointless because you're going to weak hit. They'd also prioritize affinity over whether or not the head was alive or dead, so they'd go for the living head instead of the decapitated head, and then chase the positive affinity matchup versus going for like the neutral head that's decapitated, for example. And kind of piggybacking off the last one, they generally speaking prioritized living heads over decapitated heads, so there was most certainly a lot of damage left on the table because they were never trying to kill or re-kill the decapitated heads. Now, one saving grace there is that I did notice that they would switch over to the decapitated heads when Serpent's Will was out, so they would try to avoid that to a degree. If three of the heads had Serpent's Will, for example, and the last head was decapitated, then they would go for the decapitated one, but that's a very niche scenario. So generally speaking, they were not targeting the most optimal heads in terms of damage. The last thing I noticed when it comes to the AI targeting is that sometimes they would still attack heads with Serpent Will and just do 0 damage, even though there was a perfectly good head without the buff live. That was a minority of the cases, but nonetheless, every time they do that, you're just missing out on damage. I know Plarium has come out with a couple of messages for the community talking about how they've taken some feedback from the community, specifically about the AI, but I figured I'd throw my hat into the ring and see if they want to listen to my proposal for this in terms of prioritization. I think they should focus on if someone's devouring your champion, that should be like the highest priority. Then they should prioritize decapitated heads. Then they should avoid the Serpent's Will buff. Then they should avoid Poison Cloud. And then it should be just normal kind of affinity targeting after that, and so on and so forth. At least on paper, that's what I think would probably maximize your damage in any given situation, but we'll have to see what changes they exactly go for, and then have to see how those play out when it comes to auto runs. Of course, this is only a problem when you're running your team's full auto. If you run them on manual, then you get to pick and choose whichever head you would like to target and be a lot more efficient than the AI is. The second set of observation has to deal with the Serpent's Will buff, which is reworked such that when a new head spawns, it will be immune from damage for its first turn. Now, I can most certainly say that the Serpent's Will buff change is not working as they had hoped, because there were many times where I was unfortunately able to stagger the head spawn such that all 4 heads had Serpent's Will and I was doing 0 damage. It's basically like they had Poison Cloud, but even worse because you can't even weak hit, you're doing zeros. And then on top of that, they need to kind of deal with the fact that if you have, a couple of heads with Serpent's Will and then you kill the head of Mischief, it resets their turn meter, which means they're damage immune for longer. So there's just some bad interactions that are going on right now. But mainly, I think the big problem is that you can have the heads kind of not necessarily simultaneously respawn. They could be one after the other, like subsequent turns, or your champion could take a turn in between, and then you could easily end up with all 4 heads having Serpent's Will, which is kind of bad and pointless. And so if I was to throw my hat in the ring once again, I would say that they should probably have a cap on the amount of Serpent's Will buffs that can be present. So maybe a maximum of 2 heads can have it out all at once, or maybe every other head that spawns gets Serpent's Will, so that's a little bit staggered by default, or maybe kind of adapting with the way it currently is supposed to work, where it's like if 2 heads spawn at the same time, then only 1 will get it. Maybe if 2 heads spawn back to back, then still only 1 can get it. But I think any sort of combination of all those will kind of limit it. I'm not saying to get rid of it entirely, because as I have seen from some test server footage, Trunda is still able to do a decent amount of damage, nothing close to where she used to be, so you're not going to see 120, 90 billion type damage teams, but something more along the lines of 1 to 2 billion, which is still higher than most champions can do at the moment. But again, it's only been a couple of days, so we'll have to wait and see if that is truly the case. But because they didn't really get rid of the fact that she can splash damage, they just heavily reduced the amount of damage that splashes. She could still potentially one-shot new heads if given the opportunity to, if you build her right. point. All that to say, I don't think that they're going to do away with the fact that there is going to be 100% damage reduction, but I think they need to rework how that interacts with the new head spawning, just because it's very, very easy to end up with a situation where you literally can't deal any damage to any of the heads. So now let's talk about how my teams worked, how they functioned, and the main thing I want to point out here is that I ran them in the exact same way that I normally would have previously. So that means that they are either full auto for hard and brutal, and they're semi-auto for nightmare because I have a husk and I need to target the head of decay when it's alive. And as you can kind of see down below, I did not quite get to 1.2 billion. I'm blocking it behind my head here, but it's 1.1 billion. So I was just shy of getting the weekly chest, unfortunately. So if we take a little bit of a deeper dive, you can see there 1.12 billion, and you can see we did nightmare, brutal, and hard. For those who don't know, I am an endgame player despite being free to play, so I focus on the upper three of the difficulties. So I'm going to break down how each of these teams performed now relative to how they used to perform before, but I want to point out that there is a significant amount of missing damage just because the AI targeting is not as optimized as it could be. And as a general trend that I noticed throughout all three difficulties of the runs is that rarely did I ever break the amount of HP from the decapitated head. So I usually never force them to respawn. Most of the time they would still take their 2 turns and respawn just like they used to before. So for me, I don't have enough DPS on a consistent basis to just constantly be making the heads respawn. So just keep that in mind as we talk through each of the teams. So starting at the top, let's take a look at the Nightmare team. It came out with 122 million, and that is compared to an average, let's say, of around 220 million prior to the nerf, which is a reduction in damage of about 44%. Now, I want to point out that this team usually didn't hit the turn limit before, and of course, this time they didn't hit the turn limit either. For teams that were hitting the turn limit, your damage was going to be reduced by 33% regardless, just because there's 500 less turns in the battle. But in my case, I expected that to be a little bit more because I wasn't getting to the turn limit before, and I still wasn't able to reach it with all the changes. Now, the main thing I want to point out here is that we do have 2 enemy max HP champions with Wallmaster Atharion and Husk, and they did get sort of a soft buff when it comes to hitting the decapitated heads because they have twice as much HP as they used to. That means they effectively get double damage compared to what they would normally do on a decapitated head. They normally just hit the 10% max HP cap, and now that they have twice as much HP, the 10% is twice the damage as it used to be. So there was most certainly an increase in the relative damage output of the enemy max HP nukers, and then obviously Mishinaki is getting a huge benefit from the Hex kind of splashing those 2 champions damage, and then you can see a little bit of tidbits of damage from the rest of the supports on the squad. For the Brutal run, honestly, this team was quite disappointing this go around. I felt like the damage was most certainly lacking, and this team was definitely more subjected to the pain of the increasing of the barrier when it comes to devouring champions. Prior to the Hydra changes, this team would usually hit the turn limit. It depends on a little bit on RNG, but most of the time they would have hit the turn limit and they were doing basically the same damage as my Nightmare team, so around 220 million. And in this case, we only did 101 million, which is a decrease of around 55%. So once again, the base change that you're going to experience if you were used to hitting the turn limit is going to be 33%. So we're obviously going to have that in effect here. But because after the changes, we are no longer hitting the turn limit, I did expect the reduction to be more than the 33% bare minimum. I would definitely say this team is more of a team of attrition where we have a good amount of damage spread across the entirety of the team. A lot of it's concentrated within the Hex champions just because they get a lot of credit for everyone else's damage. But it was definitely more difficult to free champions with this particular composition. Believe it or not, the hard team was the one that performed the best across the board. And so this team did 165 million. Usually before it would most certainly hit the turn limit, and this would be around 300 million. So we only dropped around 42% of our damage. And this one is relatively apples to apples. And so there is the 33% cutoff because the amount of turns is reduced by 33%. And then there's a little bit of extra damage fall off just because of all the other changes on top of, like I mentioned, the AI and them not prioritizing decapitated heads. This is the only team where every so often the targeting happened to line up and they were able to to force heads to respawn by kind of overpowering them with damage. And so you can see that majority of the damage is concentrated into Harima and Mishinaki. Mishinaki, of course, getting credit for the Hex damage from everyone else, and then Varl is coming in third place with the 30 million. So decent amount of damage across the triple DPS, and then a little bit of damage from the supports here and there. So I think the main part of this video that I wanted to talk about is what do we do next? Do I head to Reddit and start moaning and complaining about me not getting my chest all of a sudden after the changes? No. I started looking a little bit closer at my teams and seeing what I can do to improve them. The first thing I noticed was that I did not have a clean distribution of damage between the 3 difficulties. And what I mean by that is in terms of clash points, you could see that Nightmare gave me about 500 million worth of points, Brutal only gave me 300 million, and then Hard gave me 330. Obviously, higher difficulties will result in lower damage for average or good teams, but since each of the raw damage amounts is multiplied by 4, 3, and 2 respectively for each of the difficulties, you would expect that Nightmare would give you the most points, followed by Brutal, and followed by Hard. So that tells me right away that my Brutal team is severely underperforming. So this team should really be giving me around 400 million worth of points, and that alone would close the gap for me in my personal situation for getting back to the 1.2 billion. But with that in mind, that made me think that perhaps I need to rework the team for Brutal and perhaps kind of mix and match between Nightmare and Brutal to kind of spread my enemy max HP champions across both of them. I'll kind of have to see what I want to do, because like I said before, I was able to get a reasonable amount of damage on Brutal because it would usually get to the turn limit, so it was more about chip damage than burst damage. The other thing I decided to do was think about champions who I could change their gear on, upgrade it, rework it, and stuff like that to try and increase the amount of damage we're already doing. So when it comes to the Nightmare team, what I opted to do was Hanorok is a pretty tanky champion already. I believe before she had like 60,000 HP and 3,500 defense, and so I looked at her build and I was like, maybe we can just build her with some crit rate and some crit damage, put crit rate on the gauntlets, and we can take a look at the champions that changed a bit later, in more detail. But I essentially built her now for a little bit of damage. She doesn't hit super hard, but she can probably do a little bit more than 3.5 million on a subsequent run. I also took a look at my Mishinaki and I rebuilt him into 4-piece Merciless, so that way he gets the extra cooldown reduction, which should on average lead to more AoE hexing and more AoE decreased defense. For the Brutal team, like I said, I'm considering kind of making some champion swaps to improve the efficiency of this team. One thing I thought of that I will test out next week was taking out Contra the Cyclone and putting in Wixwell, not in some broken sort of way, but just kind of using the fact that when he's the lead champion and all things are equal across your team, the Head of Decay will target the lead of the team and he's going to have counterattack on himself, and thus he will counterattack and usually keep the Head of Decay provoked on his own. And then I will test out if he's able to do that on his own. I will test out dropping Mighty Uko and putting in like an R-Tac or maybe my Gizmac, just adding more HP burn to this team, AoE HP burn, while making sure to keep decreased attack on the team. Because I wasn't hitting the turn limit, I also decided to put Ugo back into Relentless. You can see here that I ran her in Reflex, but because we're not hitting the turn limit, it's not inefficient to run Relentless, so I put her in Relentless. And then for Mishinaki 2 here, I did cannibalize a lot of his gear for Mishinaki 1 to steal the Merciless from 2 and put it on 1. And so I just decided to rebuild Mishinaki 2 into Relentless, because once again, we're not hitting the turn limit. And so if they can take a bunch of extra turns in the meantime before things go south, maybe we can get some more damage. Maybe it pushes up to 120 million, and thus I can get back to my 1.2 billion chests. Thankfully, my hard team is pretty much good to go, and I'm not really worried about trying to upgrade this as much, just because this has some of my strongest champions on my account and really, really good builds. But the only upgrade that I could realistically see would be magically pulling a Duchess. That way I'd have increased attack for Vaal the Destroyer, which would basically double, maybe 2.5 times his damage, because sometimes he also has decreased attack on him. And then it would also add block debuffs to the team, which just protects them from poison from the Head of Blight, and then also protects Varl from decreased attack. So a lot of damage is being left on the table because I don't have increased attack for this particular iteration of the team. So the main thing I want you guys to take away from this is, yes, things have changed, and yes, the bosses have gotten harder, but this is the perfect time to step up and try and innovate. There's a lot of room to grow now. There's a lot of things to test out. Come up and help define the new meta, whatever it may be. Is it the return of enemy max HP? Is it more about AoE damage and less about single target damage? We don't really know. Things are very, very fluid. So feel free to use the coming weeks as your playground, because like I said, it's only been a few days since the changes, and so things are not really as fleshed out as they could be in terms of fully optimizing our teams. We all had our teams optimized for the old form, and running them exactly as they were in this new form is not going to work anymore. So we're going to have to be adaptable here and see what we can change or we can upgrade in order to maximize our damage in the new form. So I encourage all of you to think about it more from that perspective. It's less about what you have lost in this change and more about what you can do to get some semblance of where you were before. But as I mentioned, I don't think the raid devs have nothing to do either. There are most certainly a lot of AI changes that need to happen, because like I said, there's a lot of damage being left on the table just by targeting the most, or not targeting the most efficient heads in terms of maximizing damage. But on top of that, I do think that they probably should and will consider either reducing the milestone rewards here for the personal reward chests, reducing the milestones for these, or more exactly what they said in the Raid Digest, which is increasing the multipliers for Hydra Clash points. So maybe we could see that instead of a 4-3-2-1 split for across all the difficulties, maybe it could be a 5-4-3-2 split across all the difficulties, which would be a huge boost in damage relative to Clash, but you'd still have the same damage output for each of your teams. Let me know your thoughts on my observations and my perspective when it comes to these Hydra changes, and also feel free to let me know how you feel in general about these changes, but of course keep it civil in the comments. I do prefer to err on the side of neutral positivity. And for those of you who wish to stick around, I'm going to hop over to the champion tab and talk about the 4 champions specifically that I rebuilt in pursuit of maximizing or improving my damage for the next iteration of the Hydra Clash. Alright, so the first champion whose build I changed in order to improve the damage on my teams was to Hanorok. So if we take a look at her total stats here, we can see that she has 54,000 on the HP, so still a healthy amount, but it is nonetheless less HP than she formerly had, and then still maintaining around 3,500 on the defense level, 276 on the speed. Now she has full crit rate, and then a little bit of crit damage, 127%, nothing crazy, but note that her amulet is level 15, so there's a little bit of crit damage left on the table. And then for the resistance, 448, and then 345 on the accuracy, because she is effectively one of my mischief tanks, because she puts continuous heal on herself with the A1, and then she also has a blood shield accessory, so every time she attacks, she gets that little bit of shield, which counts as an extra buff, and then she still needs to maintain enough accuracy to be able to land all of her debuffs. I guess I should also mention that this will be an abridged version of all of the gear on these champions, because I'm only going to highlight the ones that I changed, not the ones that stayed the same relative to their old builds for Hydra. I've already made a video showcasing all of my champions from my Hydra team, so if you want to check that one out in the card up above, it will be there as well, and there are timestamps in the video where you can hop to whichever specific champion whose build you'd like to see. So with that in mind, I'm just going to focus on the artifacts because the blessing and the masteries are unchanged relative to that video. So the thing that I tweaked on her was, of course, I changed the amulet over to crit damage, and we have a little bit of accuracy and resistance. I changed the gloves, like I mentioned, to crit rate, and we have some speed and some resistance, as well as some accuracy, a little bit of HP. The chest stayed the same, defense percentage with triple speeds, a little bit of crit damage, which is now more beneficial, and then important, some resistance as well. I changed her boots out to some that have resistance and crit rate in a combination. I used the fact that she has stone skin on the amulet now to pair her with a shield that was stone skin as well to get the resistance effect to boost the resistance, because I was foregoing the triple perception set she used to be in. And you can see here we have a lot of speed, a lot of accuracy, a little bit of resistance, and a tiny bit of extra crit rate. And then lastly, I changed the helmet to this broken set because we have already completed the 6 pieces of applicable sets, and I just wanted to fill it in with some speed, resistance, and accuracy, and then a little bit of defense to boost her damage. Next up, we have Mishinaki 1, who, as I mentioned, is now in 4-piece Merciless, formerly double perception and crit damage. His total stats are as follows: 51,000 on the HP, which is a little bit higher than it used to be, 4,700 on the defense, which is a little bit lower than it used to be, 242 on the speed, which is basically where he was before, full crit rate, 250 on the crit damage, which is, I think, on par, maybe a little bit less than where it used to be, and then we're maintaining the 400 accuracy that we need for Nightmare level of Hydra. The main thing to point out here is that I did have to bite the bullet and just take a downgrade on the gloves because I didn't have a faster pair in 6-star that I could give him, and so I stole these from one of my other Mishinakis. I stole this chest from one of my other Mishinakis as well, but it's a really good Merciless chest for a defensive based nuker, so it kind of fit the bill with a little bit of accuracy as well if I want to roll that up. I kept the boots the same, double crit rate with accuracy and defense and crit damage. Perfect. Picture perfect. And then I started to cannibalize other Merciless pieces from the other Mishinakis as well. So we have triple crit rate with some crit damage and some speed and some defense. Perfect on the substats. And then we have this helmet, which is a full split, and I would hope to replace this in the future if I can get a little bit more optimization in the stats. But we have speed, accuracy, and crit rate, which is what I was looking for. Unfortunately, that it also rolled in resistance, which I don't need in this particular build. And then to compensate, because I was a little bit low on accuracy, but didn't need more crit rate because of all the other pieces, we have a lot of accuracy here, triple roll with some speed, some HP, and then a little bit of crit rate on the weapon. I also stole a different banner from one of the other Mishinakis just to get the extra accuracy, because he used to have a 5-star banner, which is only 78 accuracy, and this is now 96, so it's a little bit of an upgrade there. And then I did ascend his amulet because it happened to roll crit damage, so I maxed that out just to boost his crit damage a bit higher. The third champion I changed was Ugo. As I mentioned, she used to be originally in Relentless, then I changed her Reflex in anticipation of the changes, but I expected my Brutal team to actually hit the turn limit, and it did not, so now we're switching it back to a Relentless set, and I happened to get some pretty decent pieces recently from one of the tournaments, so I threw these gloves on her, yet to be leveled for some future artifact enhancement. But we have HP percentage, which is good for her and her healing with accuracy and speed. The chest remained the same. I changed the boots out to ones that have a little bit more HP, some accuracy. Don't really care about the damage. I put her old shield back on, I put her old helmet back on, and then I put this new piece on, which is just speed, accuracy with some HP on it. It's not the best thing, but it is relentless, and these pieces are hard to come by, so I kept this piece, even though generally speaking I get rid of full splits. I didn't have to change her accessories at all, and she still has a pretty respectable stats overall. Granted, she is +4, like 5-star awakened and whatnot, but I digress. 87,000 on the HP, 3,400 on the defense, 258 on the speed, so she's a little bit slower than she used to be, notably. And then accuracy is way too high, but nonetheless it's up there, 579. Originally I started to increase her accuracy in order to be able to deal with the Odin's dungeon, but then I dropped back to stage 20, and so that accuracy wasn't really necessary, but I have no reason to drop it. So for now, she's going to be up there with that level. And then lastly, we have Mishinaki 2, who I mentioned was rebuilt from Merciless, formerly the gear that is now on Mishinaki 1, and he is now in Relentless, again, to try and push back towards hitting the turn limit on the Brutal team. Well, again, we'll see how that fares over the coming weeks or so. And if we take a look at his total stats here, 48,000 on the HP, 4,700-ish on the defense, 228 on the speed. I think he's a little bit slower than he used to be. And then 224 on the crit damage. I think that's also a little bit lower than he used to be. But again, I'm trading out the Merciless for Relentless, because generally speaking, Relentless is going to give you more turns and more damage overall, just because you can get repeated back-to-back procs, compared to Merciless and or Reflex just only procking once per turn or instance of damage. And then we're maintaining the amount of accuracy that we need for Brutal, which is a little bit over 300. Going through the pieces, these are the gloves that I stole from Mishinaki 1 because I wanted him to be a lot faster and maintain his speed, and these are relatively slow, but they are a lot higher in the defense. This chest I just had lying around for Relentless, but it's perfect for the spell defense with speed and crit. His boots have remained the same as they were before, double crit with some defense. I put this shield on him that no one was wearing, and it actually turned out to be like the perfect piece for him because it's triple crit rate, 6-star defense percentage, as well as a little bit of speed and some accuracy. I threw the spare helmet on him because it has speed, has crit rate, some crit damage, and a little bit of defense, and honestly we could probably glyph this defense up a little bit higher. Hopefully we get a good roll. 11, not quite, and 17, good enough. There we go. And then on the weapon here, this was also another free piece, but a little bit of crit rate just to make sure he got all the way out to 100%, some accuracy because he was a little bit low, and then a little bit of speed with some HP as well. And then, as you might have guessed, this is the banner from Mishinaki 1, so they made a banner swap. A lot of their gear was kind of exchanged, or some of their gear was exchanged, but yeah, so a little bit of mixing matching between the Mishinakis 1 and 2, and I will note that I do have a third Mishinaki for my hard team, and his build was unchanged. He still has 4-piece Merciless with the speed set, but honorable mention for Mishinaki 3 just to flex a little bit. So there you have it. That is how the Hydra changes affected my personal amount of damage, at least for this particular rotation. Obviously, different affinity heads matter a little bit week to week, but I was kind of quoting numbers that my teams have typically done on average compared to how they happen to perform on this first week. Let me know in the comment section down below if you guys would like to see a follow-up to this video showing if any and all of my changes that I just showcased actually ended up working in my favor, getting me closer or beyond 1.2 billion damage in Hydra Clash. As always, if you did find this video helpful, then be sure to hit that like button down below. It really does help out the channel, and feel free to hit that subscribe button down below if you are enjoying the content on the channel. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.